For tonight's Conversations with Great Minds, I'm joined by Dr. Helen Caldicott, the world's leading spokesperson for the anti-nuclear movement. Dr. Caldicott is the co-founder of Physicians for Social Responsibility, a nominee for the Nobel Peace Prize, the 2003 winner of the Lanham Prize for Cultural Freedom, and the winner of the Nuclear Free Future Lifetime Achievement Award. Both the Smithsonian Institute and Ladies' Home Journal have named her one of the most influential women of the 20th century. In 2001, she founded the Nuclear Policy Research Institute, which later became Beyond Nuclear here in Washington, D.C. She is the author of The New Nuclear Danger, War in Heaven with Craig Eisendrath, Nuclear Power is Not the Answer, and editor of the new book, Crisis Without End. She is currently president of the Helen Caldicott Foundation. NuclearFreePlanet.org is the website. Dr. Caldicott, welcome.
Thank you, Thom.
It is such a pleasure having you with us.
Thank you.
What is the state of the anti-nuclear movement, both in the U.S. and Australia, your home country, and worldwide right now?
It's a little on the decline. It certainly got pumped up by Fukushima, and before that, Chernobyl. In Australia, we've got a very, very bad government, worse than yours, like Tea Party type, and they want to start mining uranium all over the country. In the 70s, I taught the Australians how dangerous uranium was and plutonium and the like, but since I came to America, the corporations have moved in and grabbed control, and I'm seen as a bit of an alarmist, but I'm not. And so they want to mine uranium, and then there are certain types, like the ex-Prime Minister Bob Hawke, who thinks it would be a good idea to take the world's radioactive waste to Australia, because we're mostly desert, and bury it in the desert, and then we can start enriching the uranium and producing fuel rods and building nuclear power plants. So they're really, as we'd say, out to lunch. They have no idea how expensive nuclear power is and how terribly dangerous. So the anti-nuclear movement is fairly quiescent at home, except for people to support the Aborigines, where they wanted to build dump radioactive waste on their tribal land. In France, it's growing a bit. It's quite active. Germany is very powerful, of course, and that was started by my friend Petra Kelly, who founded the Green Party. That's why they're closing their reactors down, all of them, by 2022. Britain, medium, not too powerful. Canada, awful. Canada's really terrible. They're mining uranium as if there's no tomorrow. They sell their CANDU reactors all over the world, and you can make pure plutonium from CANDU reactors and bombs. That's what India did. And then there's the United States. Terrific organisations like Beyond Nuclear and NEARS and other small groups who hold the fort. And they're so brave, and they take out court cases against certain corporations and the like. But I don't think, and I'm being really frank now, that unless there's a really major meltdown in the United States, like at Indian Point, 35 miles from Manhattan, where you get thousands of people dying of acute radiation illness with their hair falling out, vomiting and bleeding to death within 2 weeks, and then hundreds or thousands of cases of cancer and leukemia, will the nuclear power industry be impacted? Because now the American nuclear industry is encouraging Japan to reopen its reactors. Japan is a major producer of big parts for nuclear reactors. They're selling them all over the world. Any country that buys a reactor has a bomb factory. You can make bombs from the plutonium in the reactor, and they're cancer factories. So, in truth, for medical terms, nuclear power is a great, great health hazard, which will, in the future, for sure, induce epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic disease and congenital deformities for the rest of time. So, yeah, I think, you know, some Americans worried about Fukushima, but the truth is Americans don't really care about the Japanese dying of cancer. And the truth is that they didn't care about Russians either, because I was on the ABC in some airport in the south talking to an ABC radio producer just after Chernobyl, and he said, but they're communists, they're Russians. And I said, I'm a physician. Every human life is sacred. Yeah. So that was the attitude then. And, you know, we think 1 million people have died already from Chernobyl in many countries, not just the Ukraine, which is now having a war, and Russia, but all over Europe and the like. Right. And that number could be translocated to Fukushima at the moment. But I don't know what will wake up America except if it has its own nuclear catastrophe. And people who know, like David Lochbaum, says it's not if but when. So there you go.
Well, and in fact, we're seeing this with Ebola. You know, Ebola was that distant thing in Africa until
it comes here and a couple of Americans get it. Yeah. Why are American lives more important than any other lives? You know, they say American exceptionalism. What do you mean America's exception? What are they exceptional at, except building nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants? That's the truth. Or you know, being the world's self-appointed policeman with 1,000 military bases all over the world. We don't like to be policed by America. So it's kind of an interesting situation, really.
Yeah, to say the very least.
Yeah.
You, some years ago, we were talking, and you mentioned something that has really stuck with me for a lot of years, which was that nuclear power is not carbon-free, and you proceeded to puncture that myth. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I commissioned Arjun Makajani to write the book Carbon-Free, Nuclear-Free, which he was sceptical that America could be carbon-free, nuclear-free, but he found out that it could be, and that's been supported by a scientist in San Francisco and the like. The truth is that you mine uranium. How do you mine uranium? Huge amounts of dirt have to be dug up by fossil fuel, and the trucks they use are almost as big as a house. So huge amounts of CO2 are produced in that process. Then you have to refine the uranium, more CO2. Then you have to enrich it. And it was enriched at Paducah, Kentucky, where they were grandfathered out of the Montreal Act, which prevented CFCs being used. So they had a series of cascades, hundreds or thousands of them. They turned the uranium into gas, uranium hexafluoride, and forced it through tiny little pores in these nickel plates. On the one side stayed uranium-238 because it's larger than the 235 atom. And gradually over time, the 235 was enriched to 3% for use in reactors. Now that involved an very big coal-fired plant to provide the electricity, one. And two, they used a lot of CFC gas alongside thousands of miles of pipes to cool the uranium hexafluoride gas, which is very hot. Many of the pipes leaked, and 93% of the CFC 114 gas getting out in America came from that nuclear facility. Right. And that CFC is a very potent global warmer, much more so than CO2. And then you have to build a reactor. Making concrete produces a lot of CO2. Then you have to when the reactor's operating, obviously it produces no carbon dioxide, just nuclear waste and tritium and causes cancer in children nearby and the like. I can go into that. Then the nuclear waste has to be stored isolated from the ecosphere for 1 million years, according to the EPA. You know, they've got a facility at WIPP in Carlsbad, New Mexico, which is salt caverns, and they put a lot of waste in, and then one of the containers exploded and the place is contaminated now with plutonium and americium, as are some of the workers, and I predict they'll never use that again. Yucca Mountain's out. You've got nowhere to put the waste, yet the nuclear industry has a thing called the Waste Confidence Bill. That means they're confident that one day scientists will find the answer to storing radioactive waste for 1 million years. Now, I could have a cancer confidence bill. One day we will find the cure to cancer. Or we could have a death confidence bill, like one day we'll find the answer to death.
So like cryogenics.
It's a stupid thing. But more than that, it's wicked, because this is a global public health hazard, a long-term global public health hazard, which will induce disease enormously and cause random compulsory genetic engineering for the rest of time. Not just in humans, but animals and plants, as we're finding now in the exclusion zones around Fukushima and Chernobyl.
Tell me about Fukushima. We hear mixed stories about it, and I'm astounded that the Japanese are restarting some of their nuclear power plants.
Well, the Japanese, it's a very autocratic society. I've been there 3 times in the last year, and you know what the head person says goes, and it's it's Prime Minister Abe now, who's not a good man. And he wants to restart the reactors with pressure from the NRC and the American nuclear industry, because they wanted to get going again. Fukushima is an ongoing catastrophe, and the title of the book is accurate, Crisis Without End. There is no end to this radioactive catastrophe. There's no way to get 3 molten cores of uranium out of the ground or on the containment vessels. It's so radioactive no worker can get near it. Robots who get near it get fried. And the water is pouring down from the mountains, mixing over the reactor's cores, and then is being filtered out, some of it, and some goes into the ocean. So what Arnie Gunderson said to me today is they're transferring the core to the filters and to the ocean as large amounts of radioactive material are washed out into the ocean or into these filters, and then the filters become, in a way, the core of the reactors, because they're catching americium and plutonium and strontium, and you know, there are hundreds of radioactive elements that they're catching.
Is this a strategy to titrate, essentially, the cores, to break them into smaller pieces?
No strategy at all. It's just that they don't know what the hell to do with the water that's pouring out, and they're trying to clean it up a bit before it goes into the ocean. Most of the filtration mechanisms they've had have failed. They've got a new one now they imported from America. They've got over 2,000 huge 3-story tanks, which, if there's another earthquake, could all break and pour hundreds of thousands of gallons into the Pacific. Every day, 300 to 400 tons of radioactive water pour into the Pacific, and have been doing for 3.5 years, and there is absolutely no end in sight. TEPCO is manning the reactors with about 3,000 people a day, with subcontractors like the Yakuza, the Japanese mafia, bringing in homeless people from the streets of Tokyo, people who are mentally retarded, people who are alcoholics, they don't know what they're doing, and it's a holding operation so TEPCO can maintain the prices of the shares that they have, so the market won't be subjected.
I want to dig a little more into that. Your book, Crisis Without End, The Medical and Ecological Consequences of the Fukushima Nuclear Catastrophe, in just a moment. More of tonight's Conversations with Great Minds with anti-nuclear spokesperson Dr. Helen Caldicott right after this break.
The fact that so many lawmakers are siding with the industry has prompted independent journalists to take innovative approaches to shed light on the horrific conditions at factory farms.
I saw some photos from satellite. As I was seeing those, I was thinking, well, what would happen if we could get even closer? If we had a drone that could actually be over these farms documenting what's happening. I think the fact that they're already freaking out about this, and it's just the Kickstarter page, really reflects that I think we're onto something.
Join me on Boom Bust for in-depth, impartial, and en vogue financial reporting, commentary, interviews, and much, much more. Only on Boom Bust and only on RT.
Welcome back to Conversations with Great Minds. I'm speaking with legendary anti-nuclear spokesperson Dr. Helen Caldicott, president of the Helen Caldicott Foundation, founder of the Nuclear Policy Research Institute, which became Beyond Nuclear, and author of 7 books, and editor of the new book, Crisis Without End, The Medical and Ecological Consequences of the Fukushima Nuclear Catastrophe. Dr. Caldicott, we were talking about Fukushima, what's going on there. First of all, how did this book come about? Tell me about this.
Well, I held a symposium last year at the New York Academy of Medicine on the 2nd anniversary of Fukushima. And I did that because the media, I was astounded at the ignorance of the media, the way they reported this, and particularly George Monbiot at The Guardian, who said, well, because of Fukushima, he's now pro-nuclear.
Really?
And I had a debate with him with Amy Goodman, and I said, George, don't you understand internal emitters, radiation that gets into your body and concentrates in various organs? And then he kind of proceeded to tear me apart in his blog, The Guardian, and wrote another article about me. And they say no one's died. Well, they don't understand that when you get contaminated with radioactive elements in your body or external radiation, it takes from 2 to 80 years to develop your cancer. The latent period or incubation for Ebola is probably 3 weeks. For measles, mumps, chickenpox, whooping cough, 3 weeks. For common cold and flu, it's 2 days. Maybe it's a little less for Ebola. But for cancer, it's years, it's decades. And that's the ace up the sleeve of the nuclear industry, because it's hard to do an epidemiological study and find out the increased incidence of cancer amongst the population, so they don't do the studies on the whole.
So the nuclear industry is playing the game that the tobacco industry was playing up until a couple of years ago?
And they're very clever, because the tobacco industry, it casts doubt. Well, we're not sure if smoking causes cancer. The nuclear industry is the same, and so is the people, the climate skeptics. We're really not sure. And it's a very clever mechanism to produce doubt in people's minds. I knew in medical school when I first started, 1956, we knew then that smoking caused cancer. And we've known since Madame Curie developed cancer. She refined, radium from pitchblende. She used to walk around with a little lump in the pocket playing with it. She used to watch it at night because it glowed in the dark. When she died of aplastic anemia, her whole bone marrow just gave up. Her skeleton was so radioactive, she had to be buried kind of in a radioactive waste facility. Her daughter died of leukemia too. So we've known forever, and also the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bomb survivors, they have higher than normal incidence of cancer. The old radiologists who tested the beam by putting their hand to see, if the X-ray was okay, many of them died of cancer. So it's medical knowledge. All radiation is cumulative. Each dose you get adds to your risk of getting cancer. Do not get your teeth X-rayed every year. My ex-husband was a radiologist. They make money by X-raying you. Do not. If you have a sore tooth, yes, that's all. Don't walk through X-ray machines at airports. If a doctor says you need an X-ray, doctors are not gods, although we play God sometimes. And you say, why do I need a chest X-ray? And if the doctor can't give you a good answer, don't have one.
Yeah.
CT scans give you a hell of a dose of radiation.
Yeah, I've heard that. So so your response to the people who say no one has died as a consequence of Fukushima is...
It's extraordinary medical ignorance, and that's why I held the symposium, to try and educate the media. But the media did, Matt Wald, who writes for the New York Times, he went, I think, to some pro-nuclear conference that weekend. It's very hard to educate the media. But as Jefferson said, an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. The media is determining the fate of the Earth now.
You're right.
Because they're the ones that inform the people. I used to know during the Freeze campaign in the 80s, if Mrs. Brown in the supermarket ladling her trolley up with crates of Coke and 4 kids behind, if she didn't know that she could be killed tonight in a nuclear war, we were nowhere. And that's when we got 80% of people supporting the notion of a nuclear weapons freeze, ending the arms race, that I could go to Tip O'Neill, who is chairing the House floor, and say, I want to see Tip. And he'd come out, meet in his office and say in his lovely Bostonian accent, what can I do for you, doctor? Because 80% of people were behind us. And that's what we've got to do again. We must educate people, and scientists tend to stay in their labs, doctors in their consulting rooms. It's now our responsibility to tell people what we've done with science and to teach them so they know how to use their democracy in an informed way.
Yeah. It wasn't one of the motivations for the original nuclear industry back in the 50s that you had a bunch of scientists out of Los Alamos who were feeling overwhelming guilt over the death of all those people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they were trying to say, we have to have something good come out of this. Maybe we can make electricity.
Well, there were two motivations, and I knew many of the men in the Manhattan Project. They're since dead, and they had terrible guilt. But they went to their graves still feeling guilty. But there was a psychologist in the Pentagon who said, look, if we develop nuclear power for peace, then people will get over their awful allergic reaction, anaphylactic reaction to nuclear weapons. And so it was set up because of that.
That was the Atoms for Peace campaign, I remember from
when
being a child in the 50s.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, remarkable. So the waste from Fukushima, waste is the wrong word because nuclear power plants generate waste. The debris, the detritus, I don't know.
It's going to the ocean, it's all over the land. The rice in Fukushima is radioactive, so they dilute it with non-radioactive rice. The solution to pollution by dilution is fallacious when it comes to radiation because it reconcentrates back in the food chain and the human body. The fish are radioactive, the seaweed's radioactive. Do not eat Japanese food. No miso, no fish, no seaweed, no rice. And you don't know when you're in Japan where the food is coming from. Parts of Tokyo are more radioactive than the exclusion zones in Belarus around Chernobyl. More radioactive, and people are still living there. And if there's another earthquake greater than 7 on the Richter scale, Building 3 could collapse. It's very tenuous, damaged. Down comes the cooling pool full of spent fuel, and the zirconium fuel rods could catch fire, and there'd be literally a nuclear volcano contaminating the whole of the northern hemisphere, and the thing would land on the molten core, and God knows what would happen to that. So really, and there's no end in sight. And the Japanese, instead of inviting Bechtel, I don't like Bechtel because they build reactors, but they're very good at engineering, to say, come and help us, show us what to do. They're ignoring the international community. They are not doing anything except sort of a holding action. The workers are getting very heavily contaminated and irradiated. It's really a medical scandal, but it's a problem that is a problem for the whole of the Northern Hemisphere. It's a global public health problem. And I've told my son in Boston with my 2 little grandchildren, if another accident happens, I'm flying you to Australia. And he didn't like that at all. But children are very sensitive to radiation, much more so than adults.
Is that in part because you're concerned about airborne radiation if 3 falls over, and in part because water circulation tends to stay hemispheric?
The 2 air masses at the equator, northern and southern hemisphere, don't mix. So you get the fallout, right? But the water currents move right up north, down past the west coast, round and down past Australia. And I live in a little fishing village on the Pacific Ocean. Fish swim thousands of miles and don't follow the currents. They're catching tuna now in California, which have cesium and other elements from Fukushima. So it's a catastrophe that is ongoing without an end, and no one's attending to it.
Right. When, in 1986, my wife and I and our 3 kids moved to Germany in May of '86.
Just before.
It was the week after Chernobyl melted down. And, in fact, I flew into Frankfurt. Actually, we moved in June. I flew in on my birthday on May 7th, and it was, as I recall, maybe it was the week after, but it was right after it melted down. I got off the plane in Frankfurt and took the train into town. It was raining. And I walked out of the train station, and the streets were evacuated. I walked 2 blocks in the rain to get to the hotel, and the guy freaked out, and he took my coat, and he said, we will clean this, and I'm like, what's going on? But the Germans had very responded. But then we moved there, which might have been crazy.
Why on earth did you do that?
We had an opportunity to work with an international NGO that was really some really exciting work. But I got a Geiger counter from the farm, from Steve Gaskin's group, And I would go into the supermarkets. This was like 6, 8 months after Chernobyl. And you could walk down the aisle and go tick, 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 brrr, tick, 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 brrr. And the things that set it off were apricots from the Middle East, milk. I watched the milk start get more and more setting it off, and wild mushrooms, because there was a little local industry of people picking wild mushrooms up.
Well, there are still wild boar right now running around Germany, so radioactive they almost glow in the dark.
Holy cow!
And they have to be buried in a radioactive waste thing.
So apropos of that, and combining that with your earlier comment about Americans don't seem to get upset until things happen here in the United States. If we were to arm people or widely distribute Geiger counters across the West Coast so that people could start checking their food, checking their fish, walk into supermarkets. I mean, if I were to walk into a supermarket on the West Coast now and just run a wand over the fish.
You wouldn't find much, but you might from the fish. But, you know, Geiger counters don't measure alpha or beta radioactivity, and plutonium only gives off alpha. Tritium only gives off beta, so you won't pick it all up. The government should be measuring the food. The government should be testing the fish and putting it up on public websites. They should be testing the ambient air. You know, the ambient radiation in Seattle went up 40,000 times above normal after Fukushima, a few days after, and they stopped measuring the air. Hillary Clinton signed a deal with the Japanese after the accident, saying America would continue importing Japanese food.
Wow.
I went to a sushi restaurant in New York recently, and I said, where does the fish come from? Japan.
Really? You would think that they would use East Coast fish, but...
I know, so I got my sushi from New Zealand and Canada.
Yeah.
It's really, because it's an invisible, silent killer. You can't taste, smell, or see radiation in your food. It's a silent thing.
Yeah. So in the minute we have left, Dr. Caldicott, your book, the new book, Crisis Without End, The Medical and Ecological Consequences of the Fukushima Nuclear Catastrophe, what's the message that you most want to share with
I
our
want
viewers?
people to understand the dangers of radiation and the dangers of nuclear power, and I want people to rise up and close down all the reactors in America, and if it's translated into Chinese, in China, and etc. So they truly understand nuclear power contributes to global warming substantially. It's a carcinogenic industry, must be closed down, and it's a nuclear weapons industry, and therefore it is totally medically contraindicated.
Medically contraindicated, said like a physician. That's absolutely brilliant. The book is Crisis Without End, edited by Dr. Helen Caldicott, The Medical and Ecological Consequences of the Fukushima Nuclear Catastrophe. And Dr. Caldicott, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much,
True
Thom.
honor and
Thank
pleasure
you.
to be with us.
It's an honor to be with you.
Thank you. To see this and other conversations with great minds, go to our website, conversationswithgreatminds.com.